This podcast is brought to you by the School of Advanced Study, University of London.
History of Riots, the book here, you can see the contents, you'll have spotted straight away, is not actually a history of riots. That would require a multi-volume publication based on extensive ongoing and well-funded research programmes, which, if anybody has any money, I'm always happy to have a look at proposals. I'm sure we could quite happily get on and do it one way or another. It might take us quite a long time, but we get there. But this book came out of a conference held by the London Socialist Historians Group in 2012, February 2012, and that in itself was partly inspired by the riots that took place in some areas of England in the summer of 2011. The book doesn't deal with those because they're current events, although it makes some references to them. And we didn't aim to address directly the questions raised by those riots, except for one. Historians of riots, and perhaps particularly George Roudet, who's probably the best known socialist historian who's written on riots. It's arguable, but he's certainly one of the best known, said they were a time-specific form of protest. As politics became more organised, working people were allowed to participate in formal political processes, after of course they fought to do so, then the use of riot to make a political point declined and more or less died out. Roudet wrote in the 1980s in Marxism Today, noticed that riots were still continuing, which was a bit inconvenient for his theory, but I think his view was that most of these riots were being caused by sort of far rightists and fascists and weren't really the same kind of riots that he was talking about. Well, I'm sure that was really true, but anyway.
What was the date of the article?
You'll have to Google it, same as I did, but it is referenced in the book. There's a one-page article. I mean, Marxism Today is on the whole thing is by Emil and what is written in. So, by contrast, the conference in 2012 took the view that whatever academics thought or had thought outside of the academy, riots continued and indeed continue still, and explaining them as a time-bound form of protest does not seem to fit. The contributors to the volume we're launching here today look at various specific instances of riot and how these were understood in literature. In the case of Ian Birchall, we'll come on to later. My contribution, aside from writing on the Chartist riots of the 1840s, which I'm happy to talk about if you want afterwards, but I'm really quite bored by it, to be honest, since I've written about it a lot, has been to provide an editorial introduction and conclusion, surveying the literature, but also probing what might be called the impulse to riot. The authorities tend to view riots when they occur, and this remains, despite the well-known Kaiser Chiefs song, quite unpredictable in my view, as the work of ringleaders or agitators. And there may be something in that. Even events that appear to arise spontaneously most certainly do not. It just means that who organised them is not actually known. However, you cannot provoke or lead a riot in one dimension. It invariably requires interaction with authority in one form or another. And again, in my view, it's the precise nature of this interaction that determines whether there may or may not be a riot in any particular situation. The Riot Act, which the government scrapped in the 1970s because riots didn't happen anymore, famously provided for a magistrate to read a warning, and an interval was then left of an hour or so while the rioters caused mayhem usually, before the authorities acted, and there was a certain sense of ritual about it. The indications are, and John Newsinger's chapter here in the book on the US police riot in effect in the 1930s underlines the point, that it's action by authorities that almost always provokes a riot. It's the heavy-handed or sometimes planned intervention of the police or the army that sparks the crowd, tips it over if you like, from raucous protest to the physical actions of riot, typically breaking things or setting fire to them. So that's really all I want to say in introduction. I think it will be useful to hear from John and Sean, who've written chapters specifically, they may wish to speak about the chapter, or they might wish to say something around it, or they might want to say something completely different. I don't know, it's really up to them, of course. But John.
Yeah, I mean, my chapter is about a police riot, the Memorial Day massacre, where you had the steel strike, the little steel strike as it was called, starting in the States, and in Chicago the steel workers were prevented from picketing the plant that they bought out of, and when they attempted to stage a symbolic assertion of the right to picket, a demonstration that included men, women and children dressed to celebrate the holiday was attacked by the Chicago police force, which was absolutely notorious at the time for its brutality and corruption, and I suspect still is today. I mean, the Chicago police force figured in the UN Committee on Torture's named organisations as recently as 2006. So this is a pretty notorious outfit, the Chicago police force, but they attacked and they killed 10 people, and they seriously injured over 50 more. Those that were shot, the great majority were shot in the back or the side. One bloke, a bloke called Popovich, they thought he'd been beaten to death because his brain was outside his skull, but post-mortem revealed that he'd been shot in the head and the injuries had been inflicted after he'd been killed. So this was even by American standards, this was a terrible event. But I must admit, what I used it as a way in to discuss was the fact that in terms of violence against unions, America was an exception as far as liberal democracies, advanced liberal democracies were concerned. And you've got to really go back to the early 19th century in Britain to find that level of violence used. But in the United States it's routine, and people I'm sure have heard of the more celebrated massacres, but nevertheless, for every celebrated massacre there are dozens of strikes in which people are killed in the United States, and this is something that marks America out, the ferocity with which employers resist union organisation. The little steel companies were extremely heavily armed. They possessed arsenals of hundreds of firearms, gas guns. There was a domestic internal security industry. During the 1934 San Francisco strike, the dock strike, the police actually had a salesman on the line with them, showing them how effective his wares were by firing them at the pickets. You don't tend to get this in other countries, this sort of action, I would argue. One of the interesting points is that doesn't really relate to riots, but is I think exceptional about the United States, and is something that isn't dwelt on enough, is the extent to which private detective agencies were used, the enormous extent to which private detective agencies were used in the States, which I actually argue amounts to trade unions in the 20s and 30s operating in conditions where they were semi-outlawed and were in a police state environment, but it was a private police state rather than the sort of European police state model, if you like. And this is still something I think that a lot of American histories of the American labour haven't got on board. I mean, Melvin Dubovsky, for example, who's I suppose one of the most, if not the most eminent American labour historian, is I think a bit scandalous in the way that he neglects a phenomenon that every American trade union activist would have regarded as part of the landscape in which they worked. That if you were a union activist, you were on strike, you would expect there to be company spies involved in your strike. This was just a statement of fact. People expected this routinely because this was the reality they lived in. Not only that, but Dubovsky has actually argued that America is no more violent than other countries, and he's made some interesting comparisons with Britain. which I think are particularly grotesque. He compares, for example, the general strike where the British government broke the general strike and then sorted out the miners, and he says this is no different from the American railway shopman strike of 1922. And he does seem to neglect the fact that in the railway shopman strike over 20 workers were killed, whereas in the general strike no one was killed, even though it lasted much, much longer. I kind of feeling that his thesis is so firmly held that it's one of those occasions where you ignore evidence that contradicts it. Not saying he does this deliberately, we've all been guilty of it except me, but I'm sure everyone in the room's been guilty of this sort of thing. I haven't, obviously, but you can get a thesis so you're so committed to it that you ignore evidence, and I think this is the evidence is so overwhelming. The number of people killed, every investigation leads to a higher number, and the caveat, it's almost certainly higher than I've established. This is what you get, that each successive investigation by historians leads to a rise in the number of people killed in industrial disputes in the United States, and they always say, but it's probably higher than this because of a lot of stuff I've missed out. And as well as the people killed in strikes, of course, there are union organisers and activists who are murdered and crippled without there being an industrial dispute going on. And these run into the dozens and dozens and dozens. So this is something that is very distinct. So from that point of view, I must admit I used the police riot, and I think police riot is the right term. I used the police riot as a way into this broader argument. Another point worth making about the Chicago police is that they weren't the only corrupt police force. I mean, people are familiar with Howard Fast. Yeah, Howard Fast was a communist, who wrote Spartacus, wonderful novel, much better than the film, in my opinion. And I thought the film was pretty good. But Fast, in his memoirs, is in New York, and they have a demonstration in, I think it's 48, and a load of building workers are arrested, and the police throw the book at them. And he's very worried, and he has a word with the union official because he's one of the organisers of the march. He says, what are we going to do about it? And the official says, no problem, it's all took care of. And later on, all the charges have been dropped, and he asks, how were the charges dropped? So you go down to the Cardinal's Palace, and you meet one of his officials, and there's a list of how much it costs to get charges dropped. And for what they were charged with, we had to pay so much per person. And he's incredulous, especially when he's told that a murder, as long as it hasn't had any publicity, you could actually pay at the Cardinal's Palace to have those charges dropped as well. American law and order was, very distinctive, much more like what we would expect in, the more corrupt countries of the world today. Police often had to buy their job. And then once they'd bought their job, they made the money back by extortion and intimidation and bribery and that sort of thing. America, a lot of the big cities operated along those lines. Chicago was certainly one of the worst. Torture was routine, corruption was endemic, and the police running riot and murdering these people and getting absolutely scot-free away with it was very much part of the course. The point I'll end with, of course, is that Roosevelt, whose reputation as someone progressive is vastly inflated, in my opinion. Roosevelt actually said that there was a plague on both sides in this dispute. He made it clear that as far as he was concerned, it was 6 of one and half dozen of the other, gave the Union no support at all, even though it went down to a quite crushing defeat, really because of the extent to which violence was used against it.
Thanks very much, John.
So you don't have to buy the book, because that's it, really.
Well, there we are. Sean, who wrote on the original Bloody Sunday, the one that I think fair to say the authorities still haven't actually even thought about apologising for their role in, unlike the more recent.
The Met Police website, it no longer says it, but it talks about it being a riot, whereas it's quite clearly a state assault on demonstrators that triggers the fighting, and that's the core of the chapter. But what I was particularly interested in looking at was the response within the radical labour and socialist movements to it, drawing on press coverage over the year or so following, comments and street reports of street meetings where the issues of Trafalgar Square and what happened on Bloody Sunday were discussed. And I'm suggesting that it actually perhaps provides one of the key changes in mass attitudes that eventually led into new unionism, from particularly kind of after the matchwoman strike in 1888, which was of course led by Annie Besant, who had been involved in setting up the fund to support victims' legal cases and families, etc. But it would take a lot more research into the rest of London. I concentrated on some papers across South London and looking at the coverage and debate across the country as to whether that thesis is true or not. But I thought it was worth exploring. But I just want to make some sort of more general random comments, and these aren't kind of coherently thought through because I'm still sort of thinking about it. Firstly, when I was working in Brixton in 1985 and experienced and being out on the streets during the riot, uprising, whatever you want to call it, it's a truly frightening situation to be in. One of the things that I was involved in, and people like Ted Knight as leader of the council, we were going out onto the street, we were escorting people who got caught up in the centre to take them out to safety, stopping people attacking car drivers, etc., and shops. And I say it's a truly it's a very scary situation. And at one point we were actually advised to stay inside the town hall because other people on the street detected a change in attitude, and it began to be a lot more attacks on whites, and we were advised to kind of not go back on the streets. The other thing that having again, I mean, I worked in Brixton in 1981 for a housing association. We weren't allowed to go and check on our tenants who were caught up on the front line. The police wouldn't let us through until a couple of days later. My argument has been over the last 4 or 5 years that there are tinderboxes that can create riots all over the place. And one of the interesting questions is, why is it that a particular incident triggers a riot in one place, but it isn't necessarily replicated and triggered in others? That's why you get normally a patchwork of different things. So Meadowell up on Tyneside was a one-off. 2011 is kind of very different from some of the other previous riots of the last, or confrontations in the past 20, 30 years. The other issue is that is the extent to which the police try and set up a situation where they hope things will lead to a confrontation. I was organising a demonstration against Tory cuts in Wandsworth, and we got 3,000 people out on feeder marches, and I had negotiated with the police that we would be able to surround the frontage of the municipal buildings where the council meeting was taking place. The guy I was negotiating with, he wasn't rostered on duty that day, or that evening, and another senior officer was in charge, and basically he ripped up the agreement. and herded us into a side street, and this is before the concept of kettling came in. And the mood was getting, more and more frustrated and angry. And I managed to persuade him to change tack and go back to the original agreement. But if I hadn't been able to do it, we would have had confrontation, because there were people prepared to, push out against the police. It would have spilled into the high street, and I'd arranged for BBC cameras to be on the first floor of a pub opposite to film this large demonstration, hopefully peaceful demonstration. Fortunately, as a result of him seeing sense, we made a front page, we made lead story on the BBC News as a peaceful demonstration rather than a confrontation. But clearly he was, I think he was, would have preferred to have a confrontation. The 85 riot in Brixton, a senior police officer was in charge, not the normal commander. He didn't follow any of the agreements with the Community Police Consultative Group, which led to interventions that might have calmed the situation earlier not being able to take place. And he was very much against the recommendations of Scarman, and he was using his position just that weekend, in a sense, to give two fingers to his own bosses and to try and reverse what had been agreed in Brixton. And it was, in that sense, he achieved that aim of trying to undermine things, although the activists were strong enough to not get totally demoralised and give up, but to realise they needed to continue to argue and get policing more under control. Now, in January, the British 18th Century Studies Association conference was on riots, rebellions and revolutions, and I think we should see riots within a broader context of, the crowd, how the crowd behaves, how private and public officials and organisations react to the crowd. Riots as one form of resistance, individual resistance, and rebellions and revolutions. And the final session teased out a number of issues for consideration from the wide range of papers looking at aspects of the theme from different perspectives: political, social, cultural, literary, etc. And of course this was a time shortly after the shooting of the staff at the satirical magazine in Paris, and a demonstration of solidarity with the victims and for free speech. Other aspects of the conference highlighted ways in which people resisted through individual acts rather than collective action, and questions posed: are there underlying questions that link these issues now in the early 21st century back in time to the long 18th century and before? It's noted that numbers taking part in riotous, rebellious or revolutionary activities was often small. Most people either accommodated with the things that concerned them or found ways to resist them in other ways. There were a lot of examples in the papers of different forms of riot and resistance, reference to slave rebellions, the Haiti Revolution, etc. And there's been some discussion since that we actually need to look at a whole range of issues and follow up on some of the themes. And I've agreed to organise, or try and organise, a set of workshop sessions on different aspects. So if anyone is interested in the long 18th century and would like to consider the possibility of been involved in that, then please talk to me. The other thing that's in it is that Malcolm Chase, the historian of Chartism, has just brought out a new book on Chartist studies. And one of the chapters is on the Canadian rebellions of 1837-38, which were brutally crushed by British troops. The news, of course, took a long time to get to Britain, 6 weeks. But the emerging Chartist movement activists were appalled by what they heard. They saw it as part of the corrupt Whig administration's betrayal over the Great Reform Act, the Poor Law, introduction of policing, etc. And they saw this as part of, if they can do it in Canada, they'll use those same methods. And it kind of reminds one of those arguments about how many of the police techniques used in Britain have been experimented with in Ireland, first against the Republicans. They are hardly sort of known about, but there was also a parallel, because there's a sort of an incident in Besson Wood in Kent in 1838, where a kind of religious fanatic member of the aristocracy organised Kent men to rebel, and many of them were shot by the troops sent against them. And Malcolm points out that there is a strong theory being argued by a historian whose name I can't remember, but it's in the book, who thinks that, who's arguing that the crushing of Canadian rebellions is almost the sort of final act of revolution, attempts at revolution and rebellion in the Atlantic, the British Atlantic world, and after that things change against the possibilities of serious rebellion. We saw, of course, then what happened with the Newport, crushing of the Newport uprising, and then within kind of the debates, you've got people like Andrew Somerville, who becomes an anti-Corn Law League activist, but who is a soldier who becomes a volunteer in Spain in the early 30s, who argues consistently in the 30s onwards and through the Chartist period about the futility of uprisings, because you will be crushed by superior military forces, and you've got to find other ways of campaigning and resisting. So they're just a few random thoughts.
But very interesting ones, thank you. I guess a couple of points on that. Of course, the whole one of the things about Peterloo, which I think probably hasn't been explored that much, and I think one of the reasons why the Tory government of the day was in 1819 was concerned, because of course some of the people that were organising the marches from the surrounding towns into Manchester had been regular soldiers at Waterloo, and knew perfectly well how to fire guns and organise in a military way, though they didn't actually do that at Peterloo. But that kind of potential was there. The Battle of Boston Wood in Kent, which you mentioned, 1838. The name of that rather strange man, Courtney. That's right, Sir William de Courtney or something, who was shot down with some of his followers. That was the crack regiment of the British Army at the time, who was sent to do that, very similar to Derry in 1971, the crack regiment, and of course it was the same regiment who were used at Newport in South Wales in November 1839. Not just any soldiers, but the sharpest ones who could be guaranteed to shoot down people that were getting in their way, as it were. That does kind of yes. I mean, the debate on Newport is another.
Well, guaranteed the loyalty as well, Bill, by the sound of it.
Indeed.
Yeah, well, apparently there was very careful, Malcolm suggests there was very careful decision making about which troops you moved to particular areas. You didn't want troops who had local connections in charge of potentially dealing with so-called riots. So you would move troops from different parts of the country who didn't have any kind of loyalty and connection.
Where is this place anyway?
Sorry?
Bossenden?
Bossenden Wood, somewhere in Kent.
Well, yeah, Kent's a big place.
I know, I mean I haven't seen it on a map.
We don't know much about South. It's somewhere south Thames. Before you get to official France.
The troops shooting Courtney and his followers.
Yes.
Short after the event.
And of course the thing about Newport was that there was substantial military experience on the side of the Chartists. I think one of the issues was that they didn't necessarily communicate to many of those that were involved that was necessarily what they had in mind. That was part of the problem.
No, but I seem to recall, I think in the 40s, later in the 40s, in the lead up to 48, there was going to be a mass demonstration, and I think it may have been Cold Bath Fields or whatever it's called, where
King's Cross.
the Chartists who had been in the army actually advised don't, because we know the state's going to organise to suppress it, and there's no way we will.
Yeah, you won't be able to.
We will win that.
Yeah.
So it was cancelled.
Yeah. Anyway, these are matters. That's all. So anyway, that's two of the people that have got chapters. Neil Davison unfortunately can't be with us tonight. He wrote, as you may be able to see, on around 1707 in Scotland. He will actually be in London later in the week if you want to hear him speak. They won't be speaking about 1707 as far as I know. He's launching a new book with Colin Barker, the Manchester University, some of you may know, on I think roughly speaking it was about the conditions for revolution in the 21st century, which is at the Vernon Square site of SOAS, which is at the back of King's Cross, 7:30. I'm sure you can Google that if you're keen. I'm sure it'll be a very interesting session, because both Neil and Colin are people that think a lot about the kind of conditions and underlying things that get things to happen or not happen. Anyway, Ian Birchall unfortunately can't be here today. His partner's unwell. He has sent me a couple of pages which I'll read, but I'm afraid it won't be in his inimitable style. So if he was here, he would tell me that I was mumbling. Nobody would be able to hear what I was saying. But he's not here, so I'm afraid you'll have to put up with me mumbling it. Ian says, my contribution to the book is a piece called Imagined Violence, in which I look at the depiction of riots in some novels from the Chartist period to the present. There is a complex interaction between fiction and reality. Thus, in Zola's novel Germinal, there is a scene where the shopkeeper Maigret dies after a fall. For years, he has sexually abused the women of the mining community in return for credit. A group of women castrate him. The amputated organ is placed on the end of a stick and carried like a flag. Now, I recall reading, and unfortunately I've been unable to trace the reference, that sometime after the publication of the book, a group of women strikers did something very similar to a hated shopkeeper. The episode had caused a certain degree of scandal, so even if they had not read the book, they might well have heard of it. One can only applaud Zola for giving them the idea, but my main interest was in seeing how depictions of riots in fiction reflect and often condense themes in popular consciousness, which are often reinforced by media distortions. Riots tend to be a stumbling block for even the most perceptive social observers. Engels pointed out that intelligent conservatives such as Balzac may be able to tell us more about social reality than apparently more progressive commentators, and there could be no doubt that such writers as Disraeli and Dostoevsky were intelligent and perceptive conservatives whose thought has to be respected and taken seriously and not simply rejected. But in the face of writing, some of the best writers seem to lose their bearings. Writing tends to be explained in terms of two complementary myths. On the one hand, rioters are seen as being wholly irrational, maddened by anger into a state of total destructiveness, a state often aggravated by drunkenness. The rioters are dismissed as riff-raff and treated with contempt. At the same time, riots are seen as being manipulated by sinister outside agitators. By the 1960s, the riff-raff often included students at a time when the expansion of higher education seemed to be diluting the privileges of the elite. In Simon Raven's novel Places Where They Sing, which depicts a student rioting in Cambridge, one of the Cambridge academics notes that the demonstrators had come by coach for the day from places like Essex and Sussex. I thought they looked too awful to be ours, even in the distance. Since the riff-raff lack any ideas or moral values of their own, they are easy prey to the outside agitators. Thus Disraeli imagines the character of Bishop Hatton, leader of the Hellcats. He is presented as totally ignorant of the movement he is taking advantage of, not knowing even the 5 points of the Charter. Disraeli was well aware that Chartism was an expression of powerful proletarian articulacy, with orators, mass meetings and numerous publications. Yet as soon as working people started to take things into their own hands, with a bit of collateral violence, his understanding seems to collapse into crude caricature. Likewise, Dostoevsky sums up the relation between riffraff and the political left in a paragraph of the most outstanding arrogance and condescension. This riffraff almost always falls unconsciously under the control of the little group of advanced people who do act with a definite aim, and this little group can direct all the rabble as it pleases, if only it does not itself consist of absolute idiots, which however is sometimes the case. I think socialist historians have to counter these myths with a proper understanding of the dynamics of riots, and there are some insights in fiction which can help us. Firstly, we have to insist that riots are not irrational. They have real causes which are deeply rooted in social and historical factors. That's in his very fine novel, The French Art of War. Ian has helpfully written that in French to see if I was going to read it out in French, but I wasn't. Alexis Jenny shows that if we want to understand riots in contemporary French cities, often involving the immigrant population, we have to understand French history since 1945, the way that French imperialism clung onto its territory at the cost of enormous brutality, especially in the course of the Algerian War. As he puts it, one spark and everything burns. If the forest burns, it's because it was dry and covered with brushwood. They track down the spark, they want to nick the offender. They want to have him, to name him, to expose his ignominy and hang him. But sparks are produced endlessly. The forest is dry. Likewise, riots in the Chartist age were the result of an accumulation of oppression and violence. The oppressed had no votes. If peaceful demonstrations and petitions could not achieve their aims, then rioting was an eminently rational option. Today, the most deprived in society do have votes, but apparently their only choice is between two equally corrupt and ineffective parties. If rioting has real causes and is not irrational, then there is no place for sinister agitators. But that does not mean that there is no place for leadership. No riot is purely spontaneous. There is always some leadership, whether from those already established in the class or community, or from individuals who take an initiative at a crucial moment. As Daniel Gorin put it, there's always somebody pushing for spontaneity. On the 14th of July 1789, someone, and we'll never know who, said, "Let's go to the Bastille." Others thought that was a good idea, and the word was quickly passed around. I have once experienced this process on a much less historically significant scale. Sometime around 1970, we were marching down the Strand towards Rhodesia House, which of course was defended by large numbers of police. Suddenly somebody, and again I have no idea who the person was, suggested we turn around and go to South Africa House in Trafalgar Square. Within moments the suggestion was passed on. We all thought it was an eminently good idea and turned round. For a few minutes the front door of South Africa House was protected by one solitary policeman. We almost got in. Finally, let me make it clear that I am not advocating rioting. I have no desire to see Keith Flett and the London Socialist Historians Group prosecuted under anti-extremism legislation. No, I'm sure that's right. And even more seriously, I have no desire to see rioters scapegoated and punished for taking on a state machine that is stronger than they are, as happened in 2011. There can be no moral objection to violent demonstrations against Tory austerity, but there is a serious tactical question as to their advisability. As William Morris, one of the few writers I considered who actually had been a rioter, put it, if a riot is spontaneous, it does frighten the bourgeois, even if it is but isolated. But planned riots or shows of force are no good unless in a time of action when they are backed by the opinion of the people and are in fact, a point of fact, indications of the rising tide. So, that's Ian's thoughts around his chapter. Some very interesting points there, including the one in French, which I didn't read in French. We've got a bit of time now if anybody wants to ask any questions. Ian's piece, by the way, will be on his website, which you can Google, and no doubt you can send him comments there. He sends me comments regularly on mine, so I'm sure he will happily receive your comments and probably comment on them. But does somebody want to pitch in and make any points or ask any questions of the contributors that are here?
Are you not going to give a little talk on your?
I can do if you like, if I can remember what it was called. Where is it? What was it called? Yes, Breaking Glass. Very good. Okay. I mean, what my chapter covers is the period from the sort of Gordon riots and the riots around Wilkes and Liberty. Wilkes was a sort of early version of Boris Johnson, really, but much better at it than Boris Johnson was. There's a statue of him in New Fetter Lane, near where the old Mirror building was, if you want to go and look at what he looked like. So we talked about Wilkes and Liberty. Wilkes deployed riotous activity very successfully in his campaign to become Mayor of London several times, and there's all kinds of things around Wilkes which are very entertaining in terms of urinating on things and all kinds of things that have gone on in things that he and his supporters were encouraging. The Gordon riots. Again, some people may have heard of those written about by Charles Dickens, were of course essentially reactionary riots provoked by a section of authorities in the 1780 in London. Quite a large number of people were hanged as a result of the Gordon riots, and they weren't just hanged at Tyburn. They stuck up gallows in the local areas where they came from, really largely in central London. Sort of hung them there to remind people that it was really quite a bad idea to do this kind of thing, because you'd hang up dangling from a pole. Nevertheless, the Gordon riot was kind of interesting in the sense it was reactionary. It started out attacking premises of religious minorities and so on. The state had to step in, of course, when it was found to be heading towards the Bank of England. Changed its view of the world while it was in progress and decided it wanted to have a go at the sort of bankers and moneymen and so on. So that in itself is kind of interesting when you talk about the crowd as such as a reactionary or progressive force. Is quite a complex thing, and that again was the source of a big debate between E.P. Thompson and George Roudet. Yeah, you can find Thompson's comments, at least partly, in The Making of the English Working Class, which is now available digitally, so it's much easier to find them. A very long book, over 1,000 pages. But Thompson's view on the whole was that Roudet was too minded to see the progressive elements in crowds which weren't always there when they were rioting. He writes about the Bristol riot of 1831, which was precursor to the 1832 Reform Act, where one of these characters was busy burning books and so on. Thompson points out this didn't seem to be a particularly progressive thing to be doing. Roudet, nevertheless stuck to his view, and of course the debate, which is mentions again in there, in fact you can see I think at the top, the debate echoed by Sean was between the mob, which is how the right wing historians and the political right tend to describe people who are writers, and the crowd, which tends to be how the left and left wing historians talk about people that are involved in riots. That's the kind of first bit of the what I talk about. I then move on to talk specifically about the Chartist riot, and it kind of echoes some of the points I was making in the introductory remarks that I made. There were quite a large number of riotous type activities in London during the Chartist period, particularly in the 1840s. The Chartists themselves were not in favour of riots and went to quite some lengths to make sure that their activities were well ordered and disciplined and so on. So most of the riotous activities that take place, Bishop Bonner's Fields, which is down in Bethnal Green, is quite a well-known one. There were others in Kennington Common a bit before 1848. Tended to be when and this echoes, tended to be when the police force, the new police force under Peel, who were not the kind of disciplined thugs that we may possibly think might exist today in some cases, but they were drunken thugs, and that tended to cause problems because if they'd been policing a Chartist demonstration for most of the day, and these things tended to go on much longer than they would these days because it wasn't just a demonstration, it was all entertainment and all kinds of things, hence the crowd kind of thing. By the evening things were often got well out of hand, and the police were often the sort of instigators of that, having presumably more money than most to get drink. There were some examples of direct confrontations between Chartists and the police, but more common was, so for example you get during the 1842 general strike known as the Plug Plot by right-wing historians, which was in the north of England. Troops were sent from London via the newly opened Euston Station by train to go to the north to deal with the general strike, and crowds organised by Chartists lined the route, between the barracks, Hyde Park I think it was even then, went up Regent Street and so on towards Euston, and the way that they dealt with things was to hiss and boo, not to riot. That was the form of protest that the Chartists were more interested in. So when you look at the examples of Chartist right, there was one in actually I think I talk about in the chapter in March 1848 in Camberwell, quite a well-known one. That although it was associated with Chartist protest in Trafalgar Square, it was actually something that appeared to have been inspired by G.W.M. Reynolds, who was a Victorian novelist who went on to be the owner of Reynolds' News, best-selling working class newspaper of the 19th century, sort of news of the left-wing news of the world. Well, indeed. But it was genuinely left-wing. If you can find, again, it's online. Its vitriolic approach to the royal family would be, I think even today, would be regarded as not something that most people would want to see in print. I wouldn't bother, obviously, but I think it really was extremely vitriolic when it came to the royal family, most of whom it seemed to regard as sexual philanderers and corrupt, and was quite happy to publish all kinds of stories about this subject. And the aristocracy also came in for a lot of similar treatment in its columns. So, but Reynolds was not in 1848 officially an elected leader of Chartism, but he, for whatever reason, we won't go into this, spoke at a Chartist rally in Trafalgar Square in March 1848, because this was around the period of the revolution in France. This was the motor, a reawakening of the movement. And one of the spin-offs from that was a fairly comprehensive riot in Camberwell, which was said to actually involve Chartists. It was quite unclear. David Goodway's book on London Chartism has quite a bit of detail of who the people were who were arrested. Not that many, obviously, because this is long before CCTV. Most of the interesting point in the sense that I talked about the Gordon riot and gallows and so on, but of course in the 19th century most people who took part in riots got completely away with it, because unless they were actually apprehended at the time or were, if you like, grassed up by somebody in a fairly convincing way, they'll just get away with it. But some people were apprehended in the Camberwell riot, and the interesting thing is, again, another interesting side like riots, is it's often assumed, and it's kind of referred to in Ian Birchall's comments there, that the people involved in rioting are an underclass, a lumpen proletariat in the Marxist terms, or riff-raff. But in fact, nearly all of the people arrested at Camberwell for that March 1848 riot were actually youngish, working class, skilled people with trades or learning trades, apprentices, and so on. Kind of interesting, because what that suggests is that there's a layer of people that see the riot as, and this comes back to your thing about the riot as one possible tactic amongst a number that they might employ. They might go on a demonstration, they might do all kinds of things, but they might on occasion participate in the riot if they think there's going to be some kind of impact which is going to change things in whatever issue it is that they're looking at. So, in summary, the chapter that I've written there gives some details of the riotous activities in London from sort of 1780 onwards, but it tries to understand a bit about what was behind them and who was responsible. The breaking glass thing, aside from obviously being a song which is probably remembered by a few people now, Low song is that was rare. That's the point. I mean, it's always assumed that, and even now in the sort of post riots, it's about breaking glass. But in fact, the number of times that riots led to breaking of glass in London in the first half of the 19th century was very limited indeed. And again, the Chartists were absolutely clear that they did not wish to participate in that kind of activity. Because that was not a sign of an organised, disciplined, working class movement. So, where breaking of glass occurred, there was always a fair sign that was not something that the Chartists themselves had been at least centrally involved. It doesn't mean to say that individual Chartists were not involved in doing that. They might well have been. But again, it's an important kind of distinction. And you can see this in the Chartist paper, the Northern Star. Again, it's available now digitally and free online. There are actually sort of editorial comments saying, we don't do this kind of thing. Our protests are organised and disciplined, and we don't go around smashing things. Which is kind of interesting, because the assumption is, I think, probably would be quite the opposite. So that's a brief summary of a bit of what's in my chapter, insofar as I can remember. That is.